He pushed open the door, and the tiny brass bell above it gave a tired ring. Heads turned, not out of kindness, but curiosity. His boots were scuffed, the leather cracked and caked with dried mud. His jacket, once army green, had faded into a dull gray. There was a slight limp in his left leg, each step landing with quiet patience, like a man who'd walked 1,000 miles just to sit down for one cup of coffee. The waitress glanced up from her order pad, then leaned toward the manager. "Regular or drifter?" she whispered. The manager shrugged. "Looks like trouble either way." Two young employees near the counter snickered under their breath. One said, "Bet he hasn't bought new boots since the war in black and white." The other laughed. "Grandpa's soldiers lost in time." The old man didn't react. He just found an empty booth by the window, the one with sunlight fading across the tabletop, and sat down. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the menu, not from weakness, but from years that had carried too much weight. Behind the counter, a framed photo hung on the wall. A younger man in military uniform, standing tall beside his unit, desert sun blazing off the medals pinned to his chest. The kind of photo you walk past without thinking, unless you look closer. The same strong jawline, the same steady gaze, the same quiet pride behind the eyes. But no one looked closely. No one saw it, because to them, he was just an old man in old boots. A nobody. Someone they could whisper about and laugh at to pass the time. What they didn't know was that the man they mocked was the decorated commander in that very photo. The hero whose leadership had saved dozens of lives, and whose anonymous donation had rebuilt the diner they now stood in. The laughter continued, light, careless, unknowing, and as the old man took a slow sip of coffee, a faint smile crossed his weathered face. He remembered this place, and the people who used to honor that photo. Now, they didn't even recognize the man behind the glass, because sometimes heroes grow old, and the world forgets their faces, until the truth walks right back through the door. His name was Colonel David Harris, retired, 62, quiet as snowfall. To most people, he was just another old face in a small town, but to the men who'd served under him, he was the reason they ever came home. He'd spent 27 years in the U.S. Army, through deserts that swallowed daylight, jungles that whispered death, and nights so long they felt eternal. He'd seen soldiers rise, fall, and get back up again. He'd written letters to mothers who would never hear their sons' voices again. He'd earned medals he never bragged about and scars he never showed. When he finally retired, he didn't want the world. He just wanted peace. So he came back to Brenton Falls, the Colorado town where he'd grown up fishing in creeks and fixing his dad's old truck. But Brenton Falls wasn't the same anymore. The old feed store was now a craft brewery, the hardware shop a yoga studio, and the Liberty Grill, once a humble diner where farmers and veterans gathered every morning at sunrise, was now Liberty and Company, a polished vintage-inspired restaurant with chrome bar stools and $8 lattes. And irony of ironies, it stood exactly where the Veterans Hall used to be, the one that burned down a decade ago. The same hall David had donated tens of thousands of dollars to rebuild. He'd done it anonymously, never wanting recognition, only to see the community he loved still have a place to gather, laugh, and remember. And that's exactly how the Liberty Grill was born. But this morning, David wasn't there for food or the nostalgia. He'd come for one quiet reason, to see the photograph. 15 years ago, the diner's first owner had hung a framed photo of his old unit, 2nd Battalion, Echo Company, 2009. In that photo stood a younger David, sunburnt, sand-streaked, and smiling faintly, with the men who'd followed him through war and hell alike. It was a photo that meant something. It told a story of courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. But stories fade when people stop remembering. When David walked in that morning, the new owner, Rick, didn't even glance up from his laptop. The waitress at the front, 20-something, gum snapping, name tag half peeled, gave him a once-over inside. "Counter or booth?" she asked flatly. "Booth, please," David replied, voice gentle but firm. She pointed without looking. When he reached the table, she dropped the menu with a dull thud. The coffee came lukewarm, served with a side of impatience. When he finally gathered the courage to ask, "Excuse me, miss, that photo on the wall, do you know who those soldiers are?" The manager, Rick, looked up and chuckled. "Oh, that," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "Just some old military guys from around here. Came with the building. We keep it for decoration." Decoration. The word hit harder than any bullet. To him, that frame wasn't decoration. It was memory, sacrifice, and legacy. It was a promise made to fallen that their faces wouldn't fade. But David didn't argue. He never needed to. He'd learned long ago that real strength doesn't shout. It endures. So he just nodded, took another sip of coffee, and waited. Waited for the moment when time would do what truth always does. Reveal itself. As he sat there, he glanced once more at the photo. His younger self stared back at him, surrounded by brothers in arms. Some alive, some gone. And for a moment, the diner noise faded away. In that stillness, you could almost hear the echo of boots on sand, the sound of men calling him commander. But here, in this place built by his own generosity, no one remembered his name. Not yet. The diner had started to fill up, the lunch crowd rolling in, chatter bouncing off polished tile floors, the smell of bacon grease and burnt toast thick in the air. At the next table, for construction workers, young, loud, and restless, noticed him. Hard hats on the floor, boots on the seats. They looked like they owned the place. The kind of guys who mistake volume for confidence. One of them leaned back in his chair, took one look at David's old, scuffed boots, and grinned. "Hey, old-timer," he said loud enough for half the diner to hear. "Those boots seen better days, or what? They look older than my truck." The others laughed. Another added, "Bet he pulled those out of a thrift store's discount bin." Even the waitress chuckled as she poured their coffee, shaking her head. David didn't flinch. He just smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from a man who's seen worse than mockery. "You could say these boots have been through a lot," he said softly. But they didn't stop. They never do. The youngest of the group, maybe mid-20s, was cut trying too hard, leaned over, smirking. "Oh, yeah? Like what?" "Mowing lawns for the county." More laughter, louder this time, the kind that echoes off tile and makes strangers look away out of secondhand shame. David simply nodded once and looked down at his coffee. No anger, no defense. He learned long ago that some lessons can't be taught with words. But in the back corner of the diner, someone had gone completely still. It was Mary Jenkins, a silver-haired woman in her late 70s, sitting by the window. She'd lived in Brenton Falls her entire life. Her husband had served under Colonel Harris 20 years ago. Her eyes flicked between the photo on the wall, the one showing a line of dusty soldiers, and the quiet man with the limp sitting alone at the booth. Her breath caught. The same sharp eyes. The same stance. Straight-backed even when sitting. The same boots. She whispered, almost to herself, "Oh my God, that's him." Her friend beside her frowned. "Him who?" Mary leaned forward, voice trembling. "That's Colonel David Harris, from Brenton Base. The one they named the memorial after." Her friend's eyes widened, but the laughter kept rolling on. None of the workers heard her. The waitress was back at the counter, gossiping with the manager, Rick, the same man now walking toward David with that smug, managerial stride. "Sir," Rick said, crossing his arms, "you've been here for over an hour. If you're not planning to order anything else, I'm going to have to ask you to finish up and leave. We've got other customers." The whole diner seemed to quiet just a little. Even the workers looked over, curious. David looked up at him, calm, steady, completely unshaken. He nodded once, reached into his worn jacket, and pulled out his wallet. Inside was a photograph. A young woman holding a baby on a porch, both smiling at the camera, and next to it, a metal identification card, edges tarnished with time. He placed it gently on the table. The sound of metal against would cut through the diner's noise like a pin drop. Rick frowned. "What's that?" David's voice was quiet, almost reverent. "I was just waiting," he said, "to see if anyone here still recognized a man in your photo." The waitress blinked. "Photo? Mary suddenly stood up, voice firm now, the kind that carries years of knowing truth when she hears it. That's him. The diner turned. That's Colonel Harris, she said again, louder this time. The man in the picture, that's him. The one who led the 118th unit. The one who saved my husband's life. Silence swept through the room. The laughter died instantly. The workers froze, eyes darting to the framed photo on the wall. Then back to the man with the limp, the boots, and the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to prove a thing. Rick's face went pale. The waitress swallowed hard, stepping back. And there, in that heavy, awkward quiet, David Harris simply looked up and said, "Don't worry. I'm not here to cause trouble. Just came to see an old memory and to drink my coffee." Then he smiled again, that same faint, steady smile. Because for men like him, respect doesn't have to be demanded. It earns its way back, one moment of truth at a time. The diner went still. Not quiet, still, like time itself had stopped to listen. Forks hovered in midair. Coffee cups trembled slightly in people's hands. Even the hum of the fridge in the back seemed to fade into nothing. All eyes turned toward the wall. The photo, that same framed picture that had hung there for years, now meant something completely different. 7 soldiers stood beneath a blinding desert sun, sand swirling around their boots. Their faces were young, hardened, sunburned, proud. And front and center, the same eyes, the same jawline, the same quiet strength, was the man now sitting at the corner booth, his weather hands folded over his coffee cup. Colonel David Harris, the commander in the photograph. The waitress took a slow step back, her face pale. One of the construction workers swallowed hard and muttered under his breath, "Holy hell, it is him." Rick, the manager, stared at the photo like it might change if he blinked enough times. Then he turned back to David, voice shaking, words tumbling out too fast. "Sir, Colonel Harris, I didn't know. We didn't mean any disrespect. Please, sir, we..." David lifted one hand gently, stopping him mid-sentence. "No need for that," he said softly. His voice wasn't angry, just heavy, like it carried the weight of 100 memories. "I didn't come here for an apology." He leaned back slightly in his seat, eyes sweeping the room. Every face was turned toward him. The waitress, the construction crew, the old woman in the corner with tears glinting in her eyes. "You know what's funny?" he said quietly. "When I was your age, I led men who wore boots just like these." He tapped one foot softly against the tile floor. Thud. The sound echoed. "Some of those men never made it home," he continued. "They died wearing boots like these, scuffed, worn, covered in dust. Not because they were poor, but because they served. Because they gave everything so you could laugh freely in a warm diner on a safe street." No one spoke. Even construction workers looked down at their own steel-toe boots, ashamed. David's gaze shifted toward the framed photo on the wall. "That picture," he said quietly, "that was taken 2 days before we lost half that squad. I don't remember the photographer's name. I just remember the heat and the sound of the radio going dead." He paused, long enough for the silence to sink into every corner of the room. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "This place, this diner, it stands here because of that day. The old Veterans Hall burned down years later, and I used what was left of my savings to help the town rebuild. Thought maybe folks could use a place to gather, to remember." He smiled faintly, a tired, kind smile. "I guess I never thought I'd walk in and be treated like a stranger in a place I helped bring back to life." Rick's eyes darted toward the counter, where a brass plaque sat on the wall. Dedicated to the Brenton Veterans, 2008. Special thanks to Colonel David L. Harris. He'd passed by it every day since buying the diner. Never read the name. Never bothered to know. Now he stood frozen, hands shaking slightly as he stammered, "Sir, we truly didn't know. I can't tell you how sorry I am." David nodded slowly. "I believe you," he said. "But that's the thing about respect. It shouldn't depend on knowing someone's name." His words lingered in the air, heavy but warm, like a quiet lesson carved into the walls themselves. And for the first time that day, Nobody looked at the boots. They looked at the man wearing them. The silence in the Liberty Grill was so thick, even the hum of the coffee machine seemed to fade. Rick, the manager, stood there, his face drained of color. The cocky confidence that had filled the room minutes ago was gone, replaced by guilt, awe, and something heavier, respect. He swallowed hard. "Sir, Colonel Harris." "Aye," his voice cracked. He cleared his throat, trying again. "I didn't know. If I had—" David lifted a hand gently, the same calm authority that once quieted soldiers on a battlefield. "You don't need to explain," he said softly. "Just learn from it." Rick stammered. "At least let me comp your meal, or hang a proper plaque on the photo. Something to make things right." The colonel gave a small smile, that tired, knowing smile of a man who's seen too much to be angry anymore. "Son," he said, "I don't need a free meal. I've eaten enough rations to know that food fills the stomach. But respect? That fills the soul. And it doesn't cost a thing." Across the room, the young construction workers stood awkwardly beside their table. The bravest among them, the one who'd made the lawn mowing joke, took a slow step forward. His voice trembled. "Sir, we didn't know who you were. We were just messing around. I'm sorry." David studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a slow nod. "I know," he said. "But maybe next time, look before you laugh. You never know who's sitting right next to you." The young man nodded quickly, eyes glistening. His friends followed, each muttering a quiet, "Sorry, sir." In that moment, they didn't see an old man anymore. They saw what he'd once been, a leader, a protector, a man who'd carried the weight of others' lives on his shoulders. From the back of the diner, Mary, the older woman who'd recognized him first, stepped forward. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached out and touched his arm. "It's good to see you back, Colonel," she said softly. "The town hasn't been the same since you left." He smiled at her, a real warm smile, touched with years of gratitude and sorrow. "I never really left, Mary. Just been watching from the sidelines." As he turned to go, Rick called out, his voice barely above a whisper. "Wait! Would you do us a favor, sir?" David stopped, turned. "Would you sign the photo? So people know who you are, so we don't forget again." The colonel hesitated for a moment, then took the offered pen. He walked toward the photo, that framed memory of youth, bravery, and sacrifice. The faces of his men looked back at him. 5 of them gone, 2 still living somewhere out west. He brushed a bit of dust off the glass and stood there quietly, lost in memory. Then, with slow, deliberate strokes, he signed beneath his younger self. "With respect, D.L. Harris, 118 Command." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then, softly, someone began to clap. It was Mary. Then the waitress joined. Then the whole diner followed, a slow, rising wave of applause that filled the small room like sunlight after a storm. David didn't turn around. He simply nodded once, the corners of his mouth lifting, and walked out into the cold Colorado morning, the bell above the door ringing gently behind him. The Liberty Grill was quiet that night. The last dishes were washed, the lights dimmed, and the snow outside fell in lazy, glowing flakes under the streetlight. Rick, the manager, lingered behind after everyone else had gone. He stood in front of the photo, the one that had hung there for years, ignored by so many, and carefully removed it from its old plastic frame. The glass was smudged, the edges chipped. He wiped it clean with a napkin, his reflection blending faintly with the faces of the 7 soldiers staring back at him. One by one, he tightened the screws on a new frame, polished wood, smooth and solid. Then he reached into a small box and pulled out a gleaming brass plate. He hesitated for a moment, then screwed it gently beneath the glass. The engraving caught the warm light from the counter. Colonel David L. Harris, Brenton's own hero. Rick stepped back, hands trembling slightly. The diner felt different now. Quieter, prouder. It was as if the walls themselves had remembered. By morning, the story had spread through Brenton Falls like wildfire. Someone had posted a photo online, the colonel's signature under his younger face, the caption reading, "He came in quietly. We almost forgot who he was." The town didn't forget again. Within days, veterans started showing up at the diner. Men with canes, women with medals pinned to old jackets. They didn't come for the food. They came to shake his hand, to say thank you, to sit for a while beside someone who understood silence and service. Students from the local high school began visiting, notebooks in hand. They asked questions about courage, fear, leadership. And every time, Colonel Harris would just smile and say, "Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing your job even when you are." The young construction workers came back too, not in dusty jeans this time, but clean, pressed clothes. Their boots? Polished. They ordered breakfast and waited quietly until he arrived. When he did, they stood up from their seats. No jokes this time, just respect. And as for Colonel Harris, he never made a speech. He never reminded anyone who he was or what he'd done. He simply returned every Saturday morning. Same seat by the window, same black coffee, same boots, scuffed, worn, honest. Sometimes he'd sit for hours just watching the snow melt on the pavement outside, the steam rising from his cup, and people began to notice something new. When they looked at those old boots, they didn't see wear or dirt anymore. They saw miles, long, hard miles walked for others. They saw stories. They saw sacrifice. They saw strength wrapped in humility. Because real power doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. It walks quietly, steady, patient, even in old boots. They mocked his old boots. They saw cracks, scuffs, and the weight of years. But what they didn't see were the miles behind them. Those boots had marched through storms that swallowed men whole. They'd stepped over battlefields soaked in sacrifice, across sands that never forgot the sound of courage. Every crease told a story of loyalty, loss, and the kind of strength that doesn't need to speak to be heard. And when they finally looked closer, they realized those weren't just old boots. They were relics of history, worn by the man who'd carried more than just himself through the fire. The same man they whispered about, laughed at, overlooked, was the very reason they had the peace, the comfort, and the freedom to laugh at all.